The baby's true identity is revealed, and it changes the war forever. Poor mechanic, 65-year-old billionaire African. The baby's true identity is revealed. Poor mechanic versus 65-year-old African billionaire. She gave birth at 65 and lost her child before the ink had dried on the birth certificate. But that's not the part no one was prepared for, because the baby didn't simply disappear. It was taken. And the reason why would ignite a war powerful enough to erase lives, rewrite bloodlines, and expose a secret buried for decades inside one of Africa's richest families. Amanda Okoro had learned to live with silence. Not the ordinary kind, but the silence of wealth. The kind that lives in mansions with marble floors and rooms too large for echoes to feel human. In her Lagos estate, sound was swallowed whole. Footsteps vanished. Voices softened. Even grief learned to whisper. For 30 years, doctors told her the same thing. You will never have children. So when Amanda announced her pregnancy at 65, the world called it a miracle. The board called it a liability. Her family called it impossible. But someone else called it dangerous. Because the child growing inside her wasn't just a baby. That child carried a name, a claim, and a truth powerful enough to dismantle an empire built on lies. Here's what makes this story different. The father was not a politician, not a businessman, not a man of power. He was a poor mechanic, 29 years old, grease on his hands, no lawyers, no protection, and somehow his blood mattered more than anyone realized. Before we go any further, let me ask you something. What would you do if you discovered a baby could decide who controls billions of dollars? What if protecting that child meant turning the world's most powerful woman into your enemy? Because that's exactly where this story is going. In the next moments, you'll discover why Amanda's family panicked the moment the baby was born, why the mechanic became the prime suspect before the child even vanished, and why the baby's true identity was hidden so carefully. That people were willing to kill to keep it buried and pay close attention. Because one detail introduced early in this story will explain everything at the end. Before we continue, if you're drawn to dark stories where power, love, and betrayal collide, like this video, subscribe to the channel and share it with someone who never misses a twist. It tells YouTube this story deserves to be told. Now, Amanda Okoro had prepared for everything. The best doctors. A nursery painted soft dove grey. A lullaby she hummed alone at night, walking empty hallways with one hand resting on a belly she never believed would exist. What she hadn't prepared for was how fast the silence would return. And when it didn't come alone. Because the moment that baby entered the world, someone else made their move. And from that moment on, nothing, not money, not power, not love, would be enough to stop what was coming. She gave birth at 65 and lost her child before the ink had dried on the birth certificate. Amanda Okoro had learned to live with the hush of big rooms. Her Lagos mansion swallowed sound, footfalls, television voices, the soft clink of a teacup. Wealth had taught her many things. How to keep trouble at a polite distance. How to hire people who made the house feel like it belonged to her. But it had not taught her how to fill a silence with the small, immediate things a baby asked for. Tiny hands, warm breath, the smell of a head, freshly shampooed. When she told the world she was pregnant, most people assumed it was a private miracle she would protect. She had made peace with being late to the ordinary experiences of mothering. At 65, she was practical and relentless. She kept lists, hired the best obstetricians, and painted the nursery a soft dove grey. She hummed a lullaby at night, the same 3 notes she had learned as a child, and walked the empty corridors of her home with her hands pressed to the swell of a body that was supposed to have belonged to someone half her age. Jacob did not belong to her world in the same way. He fixed engines and bent over carburetors with grease under his nails and an old baseball cap perpetually askew on his head. He knew the city by smell: hot oil, wet tar, the way rain turned the gutters of Lagos into shallow rivers. Jacob and Amanda had loved in a way that had surprised both of them. A meeting of stubbornness and tenderness, of hands calloused in different currencies. He was the father of her child, and he carried that truth like a fragile, heavy thing. But proximity had always been a test. Jacob could not live in the mansion. He returned instead to the small, dark tenement where his wife Mariam kept a wary household. Their life was honest, squeezed between long days and tight budgets. When he visited Amanda, he felt both precise gratitude and a kind of shame he could not name. He loved her. That had never been only about money, but he also feared how the world would judge him for being the mechanic who fathered a billionaire's baby. And then there was Amarka, Amanda's twin sister, who arrived at the edges of that fragile equanimity like a storm. Amarka was all quick smiles and careful hands. She had worn a different set of scars than Amanda. Where Amanda had built, Amarka had learned to take. She returned not as a penitent sister, but as a woman who remembered debts owed and opportunities missed. The sparkle in her eyes could be generosity. It could also be calculation. Twins shared a language beyond words. A glance could mean an entire sentence. But between them had grown a canyon of resentment and unspoken rivalry. Amanda's success sat like a mirror in which Amarka saw a version of herself that had been denied. The sister who had left town with promises she never kept now stood at Amanda's nursery doorway with 2 boys at her heels. Chisholm, a hard-kneed young man with a practiced sneer, and Emma, quieter, the kind of child who watched a room and stored away the shapes of things. At first, Amarka's return was a balm. She praised the paint, fussed over Amanda's swollen feet, and offered to help with deliveries and the hospital run. Jacob watched Amarka with a caution that had nothing to do with class and everything to do with instincts. He had grown up learning to read people by the set of their mouths. Something in Amarka's smile did not match the tenderness of her hands. "Family," she said often, as if the word could stitch them back together. She touched Amanda's arm in public and kissed her on the cheek in private. Amanda, starved for company, let the heat of a sister's attention warm her. The house, for a while, hummed with the sort of busy life she had imagined. An extended family, at the cradle of a new generation. The labor came on a thunderless night. The city's lights were a muted pulse beyond the hospital windows, and Amanda's breath was a metronome. Jacob had scrubbed his hands raw, washing them in a sink that smelled of antiseptic and old fear. He had been to Mass that morning, and had kept repeating a prayer in his chest like a charm. The delivery room smelled of boiled linens and the hush of people who had rehearsed hope for others. Amanda's voice grew thin with each contraction, but she was steady-eyed when the midwife placed the newborn into her arms. He had a small, perfect mouth and fingers like petals. For a moment, Amanda forgot the width of years and felt only the singular, immense presence of this small life. Jacob laughed, half sob, half triumph, and kissed the top of the baby's head as if sealing a promise. But hospitals are not only rooms of miracles. They are also corridors where decisions are made in passing. There are hands that take bribes, gloved hands that trade favors for envelopes. There are rooms with more shadows than light. Amarka had been patient. She had hovered in the waiting area, tracing her thumbs along the edge of the plastic chair, waiting for a chance. She had been in the hospital earlier, a bouquet in her arms, a face of sisterly concern. She had asked after the progress of labor, and had smiled too widely at nurses she did not know. And she had seen the other infant across the nursery that night, an infant with eyes clouded in a way the doctors called a congenital condition, and she had felt her chest tighten with a calculation that was not conscience. Dr. Admi had been the kind of man who believed possibility could be bought. He had a reputation for competence and for being discreet. He owed favors to men who moved money in plain sight, and he had pockets that accepted the weight of coins without shame. When Amarka found him, she had something that felt to him like certainty. Not justice, but a solution. She knew where to press. She knew how to make his world smaller and brighter. The exchange at the hospital was quiet, because the loudest crimes often are. It was a confluence of small choices, an extra hand at the nursery door, a nurse called away on a phantom emergency, an envelope slid into the crook of a sleeve. Amarka moved like someone who had practiced regret and found a better use for it. Dr. Admi moved like someone who had been offered a way to settle his debts. Chisholm stood nearby with the expression of someone who had been ordered to do unpleasant things and so had learned to do them with less noise. When Amanda first held the child brought to her nursery bed, a doctor explained diagnosis in a voice that was careful but blunt. The baby's eyes, he said, were affected. There would be tests. There were conditions beyond their immediate knowledge. Amanda listened and felt the world shift in the most particular way. Not lessened, but complicated. Jacob wanted answers of a different shape. He pressed questions about timing, about staffing, about the child's first hours. He sensed the way hands moved defensively around a story. There were papers to sign, forms to file. Someone mentioned a lullaby. Someone else joked about small, inevitable tragedies. In the background, machines beeped as if to remind them all that life kept beating even when certainty unraveled. Amanda, who had spent her life managing outcomes, had never felt so unmoored. She stayed with the newborn, tracing the slope of a cheek, humming the same 3 notes she had been carrying through pregnancy. She poured wealth and will into care. Specialists, therapists, consultants who spoke in measured professional cadences about possibilities and interventions. She arranged visits with low-vision clinics, hired tutors who specialized in sensory education, and outfitted the nursery with tactile toys and braille cards. Outside the mansion, the other child. Her name was not yet known in the circles that mattered. The orphanage would assign him the name the world handed over, was taken from a different life. The infant, who had been fetched into the arms of a different set of caretakers, arrived at St. Mary's Orphanage with a tag that bore numbers and a name that said, "In Care." The institution was a place of creaking beds, thin blankets, and fewer miracles than it believed in. It was not cruel in intent, but it was poor in resources. Children there learned survival as much as play. They learned to sleep to the rhythm of the world's neglect. 5 years, then, stretched them both in opposite directions. Amanda's house knew a kind of meticulous love. The boy she raised, called Peter by the caregivers and by the sound of the home, grew with an intimacy Amanda assumed no money could buy and yet could very nearly create. Peter learned to navigate by touch and sound. He learned the texture of the stair rail and the rhythm of Amanda's footsteps at night. He slept to the lullaby that had become a lineage in that house, and when Amanda held him, he would press his face to her shoulder, as if to memorize the particular geometry of her body. She taught him to read with his fingers and to recognize the family by scent. She compensated for a body's sieve of light with a house full of compensations. In her devotion, she found a redemption of sorts. She was a mother in practice, if not always in the biological ledger. But the house had other residents. Chisholm grew from belligerent adolescence into something harder. He delighted in small cruelties and turned them into habit. He delighted in punching cards with anger and then looking for applause. He found in Peter a target in ways children of entitlement often do. A body vulnerable from birth, a child whose differences invited comment, whose needs required attention, others resented. Amarka did not attend to Peter much. She kept her distance, attending to business, and speaking into her phone more than to the child. She called periodically with rehearsed concern, offering to take Peter for an outing she never scheduled. In public, she spoke about family. In private, she let others do the active caring. When someone asked why she left the child with Amanda rather than take him herself, she said, "Of course he's with Amanda. She has the means. She has the will." It sounded reasonable, and in Amanda's heart, it sounded like a relief. She did not know, then, that relief sometimes had a cost. Meanwhile, the other boy, Amanda's biological son named Philip on the brittle paper of the orphanage, showed a brightness that mocked the lack of luxury around him. He learned to read by stealing moments with an old volunteer who taught him alphabets on torn pages. He discovered ways to find music in a tin drum and made friends with boys who could teach him how to avoid the deep cuts of neglect. He scratched out a life stitched from the kindness of people who had little to give and gave anyway. Jacob watched both paths with a complexity that sometimes felt like guilt. Mariam, his wife, had clung to what dignity they could afford. She did not like living with what she called the shadow of the rich man's life. But she was not resentful in a simple way. Her anger was precise and selective. It was directed at those who used family like a ledger and at men who crushed other men to keep their own balance. When Jacob journeyed from his workshop to the mansion, he felt like an emissary from two continents, one of oil-stained tools and the other of silk napkins. He loved Amanda, but he also felt the movement of tides he could not control. When Chisholm's bullying moved from petty pranks to bruises, Amanda's house did what money could. It called counselors, it tightened rules, and it cleaned the marks until the child's skin knew only the smell of peroxide. But fear has ways of burrowing into bones. Peter flinched when doors slammed. He learned in the smallest cells of memory that the home he was taught to inhabit could be uneven. Chisholm's temper was a weather system, sudden, devastating, and often excused with a shrug. An afternoon at the mechanic's shop would change the rhythm of things. Jacob, on his way to meet a client, found himself face to face with two men he did not recognize sitting on the low wall outside his house. They had the posture of men used to thinking in threats. They did not speak their intent. They did not need to. News moves fast in neighborhoods where power is thin and presence is everything. Jacob's jaw tightened. He had been shoved before. The town had a language for humiliation. This time, the push left a bruise on his ribs and a ledger of warnings in his mind. Mariam, who had always been the quieter of the couple, with a patience that resembled a coiled rope, reacted like a live wire. She demanded answers and began making visits to the mansion that were more observation than supplication. Her mind catalogued small things: Amarka's late-night calls, Chisholm's new clothes, the way Dr. Adme's car had been seen outside the orphanage on the nights when deliveries were made. Amanda, meanwhile, continued to invest in solutions. She paid for a consultant to redesign the way the household shared responsibility for Peter. She bought new handrails for the staircase because it was easier to buy peace than to negotiate it, and she arranged a showcase for the local press on the ways wealth could correct inequity. Publicly, she smiled. Privately, she felt the net of control loosening. There were moments of flushed joy. Peter learned to hum the lullaby back in a way that made Amanda's chest split with pride. Philip, in the orphanage, won a reading award that was scrawled on cheap paper and taped to a wall. Jacob bought a small toy for the boy he loved from a roadside stall and walked a long way to deliver it. These were stitches in a garment being mended and then torn again. The first real rupture came not as a blow, but as a misstep. Peter tumbled on the mansion's staircase during a game. The fall seemed trivial at first. Children fell more than they should, and the house had been careful about safety. But the scream that followed cleaved the air like glass. For Amanda, that scream carried the weight of all her quiet fears. She dropped everything and was at his side in a moment that felt both cinematic and ordinary, the worst blend of life's rhythms. At the hospital, in the white fluorescent light that had once marked the beginning of her motherhood, Amanda watched the monitors with a coldness that was not quite shock and not yet comprehension. Jacob, who had run from his workshop with Mariam close behind, stood at the edge of her bed and felt the world curdle. Doctors moved around them. A nurse asked routine questions that meant little. Then someone mentioned blood types, and a paperless procedural step became the tinder for a blaze they could not yet see. The tests came back, and then were questioned. Someone said, gently, that the blood type on the child's chart did not match the expected profile. It was a phrase that felt at first like a bureaucratic inconvenience, and then like a chisel against the front of their lives. Amanda felt a small, precise voice in her head of someone telling her this should not be possible. Yet blood, hospitals, and paperwork had a way of revealing what secrets money could not obscure. Amanda demanded to see the records. Dr. Admi, who had once been a man of convenient solutions, began to look less like a savior and more like a man worried about the quality of light. The nurse on duty murmured something about misplaced files, and someone else promised to bring the CCTV feed from the nursery, because hospitals kept cameras in some corners now, a habit of security and liability. Jacob had lived his life in the open, under hooded cars, beneath street lamps, in front of men who negotiated in cash and in curt nods. He did not understand hospital bureaucracy, but he understood the logic of suspicion. He pressed. Mariam, whose instincts had sharpened into a kind of defensive intelligence, did not say much. She watched and planned in the way only those who had been pushed to the margins learned to do. When the hospital staff said there might be a discrepancy, it was as if a hand had reached into a vat of wet cement and begun to pull at things that had set months ago. Amanda, who had spent years honing the ability to respond, felt a trembling she did not like. She had loved Peter as if he were her very bones. To think he might not be hers by blood was not to lessen that love, but it created an ache she had not accounted for. Someone suggested a review of the nursery footage. The phrase landed like a key dropped onto marble. CCTV, those dark, silent watchers, could be mercilessly honest. They recorded in the blind, and some truths, when played back, were simple in their cruelty. In the hospital corridor, Jacob stood close to where Dr. Admi talked, with a face grown suddenly small. The doctor's hands were steady because they had to be. They were not steady because his conscience had been kept clean. He spoke of charts and the margin for human error. Behind him, a nurse carried a small blood cup. A lab attendant pushed a trolley with labels. The machinery of proof tightened. Amanda, who had once believed that money could preempt uncertainty, felt its meaning shift. A small, furious resolve took hold. She would not be the victim of a bureaucracy's mistakes any longer. She would find out what had happened. She would make the cameras tell the truth. That night, she barely slept. The lullaby hummed like a threat in the rooms of her mind. Peter slept in the cot in his nursery, content by the habitual measure of love. In the back bedroom, Jacob sat on the edge of a chair and thumbed a scar on his palm. He had always been a man whose hands told the truth. He loved Amanda in a way that made him steady, but he also feared the way truth could break things he was not ready to lose. Outside, in alleys and in the orphanage's dim rooms, life moved on. Philip learned to whistle a tune he could not yet place. Chisholm sharpened his tongue on jokes about weakness. Amarka called to ask after her children with an actor's cadence and hung up when she expected Amanda to show alarm. When the hospital said the footage would be reviewed in the morning, Amanda understood two possible outcomes: a correction in paperwork or a fissure in the foundation of everything she had come to rely on. She chose the second because she had learned that truth often arrived in the loudest, sharpest way. She waited. The next day, a nurse brought a promise that the footage would be available. In the small, glassed room where monitors blinked like sentries, she watched with Jacob, Mariam, and a security officer who had the tired look of someone who sees too much. The screen flickered. The nursery blinked into life, a square of grainy light and small cribs. Hands moved. A shadow that was a person slid behind the nurse's station. The infant who had first been placed in Amanda's arms lay sleeping. Another infant slept across the corridor. What they would see on that grainy loop would not be easy to unsee. The camera, indifferent and accurate, caught a hand reaching for the wrong cradle. It showed a figure, a marker, small and composed, moving with a careful, rehearsed efficiency. It showed a doctor whose face had been known to them, bending in a way that made excuses look deliberate. It showed the tender gestures of a woman pretending to care for someone's newborn, and the cold calculus of a swap performed with the quiet rhythm of people who have practiced improvisation enough to make it look like care. Amanda did not look away. She had lived in rooms where people told her what she wanted to hear. She had lived in bed with a man who wore honesty like a coat. Now she saw the practical mechanics of betrayal. Her chest tightened until she had to sit. Jacob pressed his hand into his face and let a breath escape that had the density of a broken thing. For a long time after, the world seemed to move through a thickness of syrup. The cameras had given them a new script, one that rearranged the set of their lives. They had proof, and proof is a strange mercy. It does not soothe, it sharpens. It names a harm and makes responsibility unavoidable. Amarka's face in the recording was unrepentant. Chisholm's profile passed in the frame the way vultures pass in the sky of someone else's storm. Dr. Adme's hands, seasoned hands, the kind that had performed countless confident procedures, trembled just once when he took the baby. There was a silence, after the footage had played, that had the density of ache. The hospital staff moved with legality and with the faint unease of people who realize they have been complicit. Voices were low and procedural. Someone suggested calling the police. Someone else whispered about the orphanage and about custody. Lawyers would be involved before the week was out. Amanda, who had spent years building a life that could outrun pain, realized how brittle the things she owned could be when truth was aimed at their edges. Jacob, who had always measured his fortunes in parts and labor, felt a new kind of weight. He had not imagined his conflict would sharpen into a duel between his workshop life and a mansion's drawer. He had wanted nothing more than to be a father and a man who could keep his family safe. Instead, he had found himself poised, almost by accident, in the space where anger and class met. The cameras had made his life audible in a way he had not anticipated. The discovery changed everything. Amarka and Chisholm could be arrested. The doctor could be charged with malfeasance. But arrests are acts that begin processes. Processes end in verdicts that are slow and uncertain. Amanda understood, in that clear-eyed way that had made her wealthy, that justice had a calendar of its own, and she would have to live between its ticks. Yet immediate choices pressed like tender wounds. What to do with the child she had raised, who loved her as a mother? What to do with the child who bore her blood, but had been raised in a place that had not known tenderness? What obligations did loyalty impose? What obligations did conscience demand? Amanda took Peter home that evening and held him like someone cradling the future and a last piece of evidence at once. He smelled of milk and soap. His small body was warm under blankets that had known better thread counts. He slept in a room that knew the exact topography of Amanda's hands. Outside, the world had rearranged itself. Within those closed doors, she tried to restore a sense of ordinary life, so the boy she loved would not be consumed by the machinery of legal battles and public disgrace. Mariam watched Amanda with the keen eyes of someone who knew what anxiety looked like before it announced itself. She kept eating at her table with a steady hand and a tight jaw, and she and Jacob spoke in glances that carried whole arguments. Jacob wanted the truth enacted. He wanted those who had hurt the child and their family to be punished. But he also feared the cost. How many bridges would that fight burn? How many reputations would it ruin? How many lives would it splinter? They moved, then, into the slow business of laying foundations for prosecution. Amanda employed private investigators. She forwarded the CCTV to detectives whose names were exchanged in small envelopes. She hired counsel who seemed at once charitable and hungry. The orphanage was visited by people wearing uniforms that signaled responsibility. Philip, who had learned to read with a generosity that rendered him more resilient than his environment, was given medicine and a promise of a test, a scrim of possibility that could unmask what papers and cameras had started. But underneath the legal apparatus, underneath the arrests and the formalized accusations, lay a domestic battlefield. Amanda's mansion, so often a symbol of security, felt now like a place where small children might be taken away and where other children might be kept, with a sort of guarded love that could not answer every question. Peter's eyes closed in sleep, and somewhere in his dreams, a lullaby was playing the same 3 notes, morphing into minor ones as if the tune itself had been deputized to mourn what it could not fix. Amid all this, Chisholm's presence darkened. He strode through rooms like a man who had been told to make fear look like policy. He was arrested for coming to the mansion with a swagger that suggested he was immune to consequence, then released on bail that had the hollowness of a promise. Amaka rang with a cool, professional rage when questioned. She spoke in rehearsed words about desperation and survival. Dr. Admi, who had once been incurious about the moral geometry of his work, seated himself like a man trying to remember a play he no longer felt the part in. The story had started in a hush, and now ran like an electric wire through their lives. Newspapers smelled of ink. Phone lines hummed with questions. There were interviews Amanda dodged, and those she agreed to. She did not want her private grief made public, but she recognized that truth sometimes needs light to be defended. For Jacob, the crisis made his past and present congeal. He had loved a woman out of his station, and had fathered a child whose world he could not afford. He scrubbed at his hands, as if he could clean them of what had happened. He kept thinking of the day he had first met Amanda, of how she had laughed at some car joke, and how tiny and human she had seemed in that moment. He remembered telling Mariam, years ago, that they were doing what they could for the children they had. Now he had to watch as the children were split between systems and realities, and the cost of his love for Amanda was being measured in legal documents he felt unequipped to read. And through it all, the boys, 2 small lives, were present like 2 planets in the same system, each pulling the other in an orbit they had never elected. Peter, who had known the warmth of a billionaire's house, was also the child who flinched at sudden noise and trusted candles only so far as they burned. Philip, who had been handed to an institution ill-equipped to mother him, had a mind that deserved more. Neither had asked to be the axis of so much calculation. Amanda began to sit with the way grief and power braided together. She had resources. She had access to doors that the poor did not. She also had to reconcile that her love, no matter how exquisite, had been placed on a foundation built with somebody else's deceit. She began to ask the hard question that splits many lives. What is motherhood when the line between biology and devotion is severed? What responsibility did she bear to the boy she had raised when the law might compel a different arrangement? At night, she would hold Peter and feel the shape of his small back against her chest. She would imagine Philip sleeping in the orphanage under a thin blanket and feel a pull that was difficult to name. She had built a life that allowed both feeling and action. She now had to find a path that allowed fairness without abandoning the child who had known nothing but her. The first arrests were ceremonial. Amaka, Chisholm, and Dr. Admi were taken into custody after the footage was presented. They were escorted in hands that had once smoothed the fabric of life in ways that now read as betrayal. The police moved with a cautious pride, doing what they could to make sense of a case that touched both wealth and poverty. The cameras had whispered the story before any of them stood in front of microphones and said the word swapped. But arrests are not verdicts, and the wheels of courts turn with the sluggish inevitability of slow tides. Amanda understood that more than anyone. Money could buy expertise, but not closure. She sat with that lack like a hard stone in her palm. Months bled into a grey chronology of hearings and statements. Philip was taken from the orphanage for a short-term custodial assessment. He looked at Amanda with the same bright curiosity he had always had. He was small in the sense of being young, but his eyes, those eyes that had seen the world from a harder vantage, had a clarity that belied his history. When she held him, he smelled faintly of detergent, and the dry, particular scent of someone who had not known daily bathing in the way the mansion allowed. Peter watched from the periphery as adults negotiated his future. Amanda realized then that the greatest act of wealth she could offer would be restraint and care. Money could secure DNA testing that would confirm paternity. It could give both boys the medical and psychological attention they deserved, and it could mean a legal team that would ensure accountability. But it could not, on its own, restore innocence or erase the lived experience of the years the children had already endured. The scene at the hospital the day Philip was brought in for testing was quieter than the first showdown. Medical people with badges and forms moved with the efficiency of institutions. A lab technician smiled reassuringly at Philip and handed him a sticker. Amanda watched him press the sticker to his shirt as if it were a medal. Jacob watched with a swollen heart. Mariam held his hand and kept her eyes steady. When the first DNA swab test returned as a positive match, showing without ambiguity that Philip was Amanda's biological son, the sound that rose in the hospital was not triumph. It was relief, threaded with sorrow. Amanda folded into herself and cried not because she had been vindicated, but because the revelation rearranged everything else that had happened. The years of loving the wrong child were not nullified. They were made immeasurably more complicated. That night, as the city lights blinked like distant constellations, Amanda sat in the nursery with two small sleeping forms within reach. She thought of all the hands that had moved in that room when she was in labor, and of the quietness that had hidden a lie. She thought of Dr. Admi's face in the footage, and of Amaka's casual hands as they enacted a plan that had cost more than money. She thought of Jacob's bruises and Mariam's tightened jaw. There were many things to be done. There would be more hearings. There would be public curiosity and private recalibration. There would be questions only time could answer. But in the immediate warmth of the nursery, Amanda made a choice that startled even her. She would keep both boys close. She would not let the machinery of justice tear from Peter the only mother he had known. She would reclaim Philip because that was her right. But she would not abandon the child who had slept on her chest, who had learned the shape of her lullaby, who had grown in the cadence of her house. So she prepared for the long haul. She hired counselors who specialized in trauma and child attachment. She redesigned the household so that Peter would have a space that felt safe and separate from courtrooms and police statements. She promised the orphanage she would support Philip's education and medical care, and that she would be diligent about his integration. She wanted to be fair, and fairness meant a kind of complex tenderness that would be harder than anger. In the weeks that followed, Jacob and Mariam found themselves at the center of a tide they had not asked for. Jacob, a mechanic whose daily rhythms had been the repair of engines, not the repair of families, felt a shift in his identity. He had been pushed into a public role, father, defender, a man on the side of truth. His hands, always steady in their practical intelligence, trembled once as he held Philip and felt, for the first time, the weight of legacy he had helped create. Yet not all wounds stitch quickly. Chisholm, Amarka's son, remained defiant and dangerous. Though arrested, he was also released into a future that looked, for now, uncertain. The law had begun to move, but some outcomes were indeterminate. The recovery of the boys would be labored and incomplete in ways the cameras could not capture. Amanda's life, which had once been ordered by schedules and philanthropic missions, now kept a new urgency. To protect both of the children placed in her orbit, to reconcile the claims of biology and devotion, and to manage the seams of a family that had, in secret, been rent. She had money enough to hire lawyers and therapists, but she also had to reckon with the moral ledger that wealth could not erase. When she looked at the two boys, one who had been raised at her breast in all but biology, the other who had been denied the comforts she could provide, she felt an ache that was not simply possessive. It was a deep, raw knowledge that human lives had been rearranged by greed and cunning, and it would take more than evidence to put them back together. The story was not over. The cameras had told a truth that would affect many lives, but it had not yet restored all that had been taken. Legal battles loomed. Healing would be necessary. Both boys would need more than resources to become whole. Amanda's fight was not just with a marker or with a corrupt doctor. It was with the idea that money alone could fix moral harms. For now, in the heavy, honest night, she held Peter and felt his small chest rise and fall like a prayer. She had recovered the truth. The baby's identity had been revealed, but the work of repair stretched ahead like a horizon she could not yet see. Jacob slept in a chair, hands in his lap, his face leafed with lines of worry he could not smooth. Mariam sat across the room, knitting in silence, while whispers of the future moved through the house like wind. Outside the mansion, the city went on. St. Mary's orphanage hummed with life and the familiarity of endurance. Men in suits talked about lawsuits and settlements. The police files thickened. But inside the nursery, two boys dreamt two different dreams under the same roof, and a woman who had once expected to be judged for daring to become a mother at 65 now found herself tested in ways she had never imagined. The cameras had opened a door. The rest would be lived one difficult day at a time. The house hummed with a different kind of vigilance now. Quiet, watchful, wired to the small rhythms of recovery. Amanda slept in short, spasmodic stretches and woke to the shape of two breathing bodies. She walked the nursery like someone stepping through a ceremony, checking rails, testing nightlights, setting cushions in place so no child would tumble into cold floor. The cameras that had betrayed a betrayal now watched to protect. Security men came and went with clipped reports. Lawyers filled one room while counselors set up another. The world had cleared into duties and appointments, and Amanda moved through them with that old practiced exactness she had used to run corporations. If you want the full depth of this story, stay with us, subscribe, and follow what happens next. News vans came at times that were the most invasive. Dawn, when silence is supposed to be a favor. Amanda avoided the bright lenses and answered only through statements arranged with counsel. The public narrative wanted a villain, a neat moral to hang on a headline. But what lived inside the mansion was neither simple nor final. There were two boys to feed and to shield, two fathers, one by blood, one by devotion, to reckon with, and a sister whose face had been recorded forever as the fulcrum of deceit. Police began moving in a way that was both formal and messy. Arrests had been made, yes, but arrests were the hinge of a much slower door. Amaka sat in a cell that had none of the soft fabrics of the house where she had once sought comfort. She answered questions with a steady voice that sometimes cleaved toward flippancy and sometimes toward calculation. She spoke of debts, of being overlooked, of a life that had taught her to seize leverage where she could find it. She never used the word evil. She used the word opportunity, as if that could cover the space of a child's life. Chisholm, when he was brought before a magistrate, swaggered in a way meant to unnerve. But swagger is brittle under fluorescence. He had the look of a boy who had been trained in intimidation. In custody, he was quieter, and sometimes his eyes flicked to corners as if fearing himself. Emma, the quieter nephew, sat with his head lowered, the weight of being close to wrong done to others tamping down whatever defenses he might have once shown. Dr. Admi, who had once been a man cloaked by the professional dignity of his white coat, moved with a different gravity. Where he had been a charismatic, convenient solver, he now limped under the record of his actions. He had been recorded on hospital footage performing the exchange. He had, in the slow, corrosive way of compromised people, accepted an envelope that altered the course of 5 lives. When investigators showed him the footage, his hands, those same tools that had once steadied scalpel and needle, shivered. But legal theater was not the same as moral certainty. The police could detain, and a prosecutor could indict, but trials would be scheduled, defenses prepared, and the weight of evidence tested against rule and procedure. Amanda knew that the cameras had made a clean window of a messy world, but she also knew courts required more than a frame. They required witnesses, chain of custody, and an unbroken link between motive and act. The paperwork and the formalities ate time, and time was a costly thing when children were waiting to be understood, not merely proven. Jacob watched these proceedings from a place that did not fit neatly into anyone's headline. He was a man who preferred wrenches to rhetoric. He had been pulled into a fight that asked more than he had the habit of giving. He wanted immediate consequence, swift retribution. He wanted to see hands cuffed and punished for the damage they had done. Amanda, with a reserve that sometimes read as cold, wanted steadiness, care plans for 2 boys, a public posture that would not traumatize them further, and lawyers who would ensure the guilty were held to account in court rather than in the press. They argued quietly in the late hours. Jacob accused the lawyerly process of being too slow, of letting power hide in paperwork. Amanda, who had learned the value of methodical strategy, retorted that haste could undo the very justice they sought. There was an edge to Jacob's words that came from a place of exhaustion and love. He had been beaten before and had felt the town's appetite for humiliation. Mariam, when she spoke, kept her voice low and precise. She had seen how small cruelties grew into community myths. She feared for Jacob's safety, but also for the boy's well-being. Her steadiness was a counterweight to Jacob's fire. The orphanage, St. Mary's, became a place of transport and paperwork, as well as memory. Philip, the bright boy whose life had been lived under scarcity, was brought into a new orbit he had not asked for. He was curious and baffled and resilient in ways that revealed a strange moral courage. He asked many questions in fragments. Where was the room with velvet curtains? Did everyone here have a car? Do we have to go back? Amanda answered in the language children understand best, with hands and presence. She sat on the floor with him and learned to arrange his small things into a pattern that would feel familiar. She held his wrist and showed him the indent from a watch she had once worn, and for the first time in years, he felt the shape of a woman who intended to insist on him. When the formal DNA results came, they offered a clinical kind of closure. The match was confirmed. It felt, in one sense, absolute, the kind of thing that does not leave room for doubt, and in another sense, devastating, because it rearranged the moral arithmetic that had grown around Peter. Amanda folded under the weight of the fact, and then straightened with an immediate, practical clarity. Philip would need enrollment in a school with support. He would need medical checkups that would strip away the stitches that time had covered. He would need someone who could be both broker and buffer with social services. Amanda allocated all of it without fanfare. That, too, was a kind of penance she had chosen. But neither proof nor provision could rewrite what Peter had lived through. He had been mothered, messy, imperfect, devoted by Amanda for 5 formative years. He had learned her face, her smell, the cadence of her voice. He had lived inside a mattress of privilege that could not insulate him from the small cruelties a house could hold. To take him from that orbit without care would be another kind of violence. Amanda understood this with a clarity that made her decisions both kinder and harder. She would not make Peter a pawn to prove a point. She would hold him. She would not abandon him to the echo of a life suddenly declared illegitimate. That position sometimes made Jacob bristle. He loved Philip, but he could also see how Amanda's resources insulated her from the communal damage that had been dealt. He resented the way money smoothed the edges of scandal. He resented that his voice, too procedural and too small, could be drowned. In town, he heard men whisper that a mechanic should not meddle with a billionaire's affairs. He answered with actions, visits with Philip, small gifts delivered with a tenderness that did not court publicity, and long nights spent reading to the boy with a concentration that made the rest of his life shrink to the size of those hours. Counseling began in earnest. Amanda insisted on specialist teams. Child psychologists experienced in attachment trauma, family therapists who could navigate the messy ethical field where biology and devotion collided, and educational consultants who knew how to place a child who had known both deprivation and abundance. The first sessions were odd and fragile. Peter had nights where he woke and called for a woman whose chest had not been in the same room for 5 years. Philip had the cautious joy of someone whose trust was newly invited. Therapists called the process reparation and integration, but Amanda and Jacob thought in the language of small acts: extra stories at bedtime, 2 seats at the dinner table, an allowance of patience that would require a lifetime. Amid the therapeutic work, the legal machine continued to grind. Hearings were scheduled, witnesses were queued. The hospital had its own internal inquiry to answer. Private counsel for Amanda negotiated with prosecutors, producing documents and statements and recordings. The footage from St. Nicholas Hospital, grainy, mercilessly precise, became a central piece of evidence, but defense counsel raised questions. Chain of custody, whether all procedures had been properly recorded, whether an overwhelmed hospital staff could account for every person on a long, busy night. The push and pull of legal procedure did not diminish the moral clarity of what had been done. It complicated the path to a decisive penalty. Amid it all, Amarka told her story, in fragments, to anyone who would listen who might soften the narrative. She spoke of a life of scarcity, of doors slammed in her face, of opportunities that had been siphoned away by relatives who had succeeded. She said she had acted because she believed it would give her sons a better life. Her words read to some as confession, to others as cold rationalization. She did not deny the deed. She argued instead with a kind of entitlement softened into grievance. The statements did little to heal the rawness she had created. For Amanda, there was a small, peculiar horror in watching her own flesh and blood speak in the language of claim. Twins had a genealogy of intimacy. Amarka had reallocated that intimacy into a ledger of debt and entitlement. Chisholm, released on bail, prowled the edges of scenes with a calculated audacity. He called friends. He put pressure on men who owed him favors. He ran at times into Jacob at the mechanic's workshop and smirked as if daring any fist to answer his presence. Once, a courier dropped a parcel at Jacob's door that contained nothing but a note. "Stay away." Jacob answered with the things he could do. He kept Philip close. He installed a light in the yard. He learned the routes of the men who might threaten his family. Mariam took up a quiet armor. Visits to community leaders. Calls to men she'd once known in the church. A network of people who had quietly seen wrong and now lent their sight aloud. In the public sphere, opinion split along the grooves of class and sentiment. Some saw Amanda as a woman who had been victimized despite her wealth, betrayed by blood. Others saw an irony in a billionaire's child being taken and then fought for with resources most could not command. The social commentary probed every angle, from corruption in medicine to the state of care in orphanages. Editors wrote long features on institutional neglect and short columns on family betrayal. Amanda read selectively and focused on immediate tasks. She did not want to be a symbol. She wanted to be a mother. Yet being a mother in the glare of public scrutiny has its own tragedies. Privacy became a kind of currency Amanda could not spend. She began to wonder what of her life had been a stage even before the swap, and what now belonged to a public appetite to watch pain resolved. She kept a journal in which she wrote small lines that were not meant for publication. The exact shade of hair on Philip's head, Peter's small thumb-sucking habit that returned in stress, Jacob's habit of leaving grease on his palms after he had washed them clean. These were the private textures of recovery. The boy's integration into daily life offered moments of pure tenderness. Philip, at first stiff with overwhelm, discovered the house's garden. He ran the length of it and laughed at the way the gravel crunched under his sandals. He found a den under an old guava tree and declared it his secret place. Peter learned new routes around the house and channeled his imagination into tactile play. Amanda watched them and felt in those small hours that she was learning a new form of stewardship, one that required less ownership and more listening. Still, scars surface in quiet ways. Peter, who had known Chisholm's temper, started each day with a tug at his sleeve, asking in a small, urgent voice if the man would return. Philip, who had known the orphanage's scarcity, hoarded small things in his pockets and would not let others see what he had collected. Therapists found in these habits the slow mapping of fear, and they worked with the boys to build routines, predictable meals, rituals at bedtime, and small commitments to social interactions that would, with patience, rebalance anxieties. Amanda's philanthropy shifted tone. Where once she had given to big public projects, she now invested in quiet, targeted things: secure training for staff at local orphanages, funds earmarked for psychological support for children who had experienced separation, and a discreet endowment for St. Mary's that would not be a headline, but would change daily life for its residents. She wanted to use the very tools that had afforded her a private solution to make public systems less brittle. But money alone was not a salve. Amanda found herself in meetings where bureaucratic inertia slowed progress. She learned that institutions have their own resistances and that goodwill can be shop-worn. She practiced patience, and, when necessary, insisted with a force that often surprised even her. The people she hired to help, administrators, therapists, social workers, were a new kind of team that attempted to stitch private resources into public need. As the months layered, the legal case threaded toward a preliminary hearing. Witness statements were read aloud. Security footage was scrutinized and counter-scrutinized. Dr. Admi sat in a stark chair in a courtroom, his hands folded, and sometimes he looked as if the weight of what he had done had yet to lodge fully inside his bones. Amaka was escorted into the room with a steadier gait than some expected. She had worked, after the arrests, to craft a narrative that would make her actions appear as desperate maneuvering rather than cold calculation. Her lawyers argued procedural errors. The prosecution laid out a pattern of planning. The room heard both sides. The judge adjourned for deliberation, and time swam along while people waited in pockets of expectation. Jacob attended the hearing and felt hollow afterward. He had hoped the court would be a place where anger would be smoothed into consequence. Instead, the law felt like a river with banks he could not cross. He returned to the workshop and for a while fixed cars with hands that trembled from sitting in judgment. Mariam kept her composure, but asked in private what would happen to Chisholm, whether he would be made to repair what he had broken. The correct answer, the legal one, was indefinido. The court set dates. The story split between what could be proved and what could not. In the margins of these formalities, human reckonings continued. Amaka, in custody, wrote a letter to Amanda at one point. She asked for a meeting that Amanda granted under strict supervision. The two sisters sat in a room that had none of the old intimacy and all of the sterile quality of a place designed for reconciliation, yet shaped by the suspicion of surveillance. Amaka did not begin with apology. She began with an argument about life's unfairness. Amanda listened without interrupting. There were moments when Amanda's eyes filled not with rage but with a profound sorrow that seemed to think of the years when the sisters had shared secrets and sweets. The conversation yielded no absolution. It yielded instead the stark reality of family fractured beyond repair and the reasoned resolve to protect the children above all else. One afternoon, Chisholm tried to approach the mansion. Security intercepted him before the gates. He shouted words that were half threat and half plea, and then he left in a cloud of gasoline fumes and rumor. Amanda did not pursue a vengeful path. She increased protections, she sought restraining orders, and she insisted on a plan for Chisholm's accountability that went beyond jail. Rehabilitation, counseling, monitored community service where he would have to confront the lives his actions had damaged. Whether the legal system would enforce such a plan, or whether it would fall into the same crevices that let his family's earlier schemes flourish, was again indefinido. Months turned toward a slow ritual of check-ins and hearings. The public interest waned somewhat as other stories emerged, but the private labor of recovery intensified. Amanda discovered that tending to two boys meant enduring small daily collisions that no public statement could fully account for. Arguments over toys, privacy concerns, jealousy that blossomed when Philip received tutoring and Peter became possessive of amenities he had never known to be threatened. Amanda had made a moral commitment that was both noble and messy. She kept to it. There were moments, a rainy afternoon when Philip pressed his face to the living room window and watched the city blur, that felt irretrievably hopeful. Philip had been placed in a preparatory class where teachers noted his enthusiasm and his hunger to learn. Peter, who navigated the house with an intuitive map of sound and touch, began to enjoy stories read aloud about color and animals, which had once seemed abstract to a boy who could not see but now bloomed in description. The small domestic victories mattered as much as the big legal motions. Amanda celebrated both with equal solemnity. The trial, or rather, the parts of the legal movement that reached public view, became a scaffolding of testimonies. Nurses testified about a busy night, and a staff that had less oversight than it needed. Security footage was replayed in court, grainy and precise, showing hands that had chosen to move the cradles. Dr. Adme's motive, the envelope, was examined as if the money itself were a character in the drama. Amaka's lawyer painted her as a desperate mother trying to create security for her sons. The prosecution painted her as a woman who weaponized kinship. The truth lived in both descriptions, and neither could, alone, assemble the moral picture. When the judge issued an interim ruling that allowed Philip to remain in Amanda's temporary care while further evaluations proceeded, Jacob felt relief tempered by a bitterness that his feelings were subordinated to legal form. Yet the decision was also, in many small ways, right. Philip's life needed continuity, and a sudden uprooting would have been another trauma. Amanda promised, publicly and privately, to make his transition as gentle as possibility allowed. She also promised to continue support for St. Mary's so that other children would have fewer reasons to be arranged into harm. And there remained, always, the question of what justice would look like. The legal system could deliver verdicts, fines, or sentences. It could name wrongs and assign penalties. But justice for a child cannot be fully rendered on a docket. The psychological, social, and moral gaps required a different kind of addressing. Patience, sustained care, community accountability, and a restructuring of the systems that allowed a swap to happen in the first place. Amanda funneled resources into training for hospital staff on chain of custody and into advocacy for better oversight. She believed that if her money could erect scaffolding to reduce the chance of another child being lost to corruption, then something useful would come of her grief. Time did not heal everything. There were nights when Amanda sat in the dark and felt her age with a new kind of clarity, how years had gathered into the body that now held two small lives. She thought sometimes about the irony that had lodged in her chest. She had fought to regain a birth she had almost lost before its papers were signed, and in doing so, she had turned her life into a public case study. She had wanted a baby far later than custom expected, and when fate brought that baby into her arms, it had been stolen. Now motherhood required more than lullabies. It required strategy, law, patience, and the humility to accept help. Jacob, meanwhile, found a kind of new citizenship in the contest. He became both public and private. A father who read court calendars at night, a mechanic who fixed the rusted things of his block, a man who learned to speak in forms and affidavits when he needed to. He had not chosen publicity, but he understood now how truth and visibility could bend systems toward accountability. He used his hands differently, to hold sons and to sign papers that would formally assert his rights and protect his children. Months after the discovery, when the city itself had moved on to new concerns, the home found a rhythm that, while not whole, functioned. Philip laughed more easily around other children. Peter, still tender and wary, enjoyed tactile lessons and a patient therapist who taught him sound signaling games. Amanda and Jacob, who had been pulled into each other's orbits in complicated ways, found moments of solidarity. It was not a reconciliation of the romantic kind. It was a partnership forged in the labor of shared responsibility. They stood together in the nursery and planned for school enrollment and security reviews and a future that would not fit neatly into any one person's design. As for Amarka and Chisholm and Dr. Admi, the legal paths remained open and uncertain. Guards escorted them to court dates, attorneys filed motions, the press printed snapshots. Whether they would be convicted or what sentences they might face at the end of proceedings, those outcomes remained indefinido. The law had begun a process. It had not yet closed it. Amanda accepted that public closure would take a different time than the private requirement of healing. One late evening, as rain rimmed the windows and the house smelled of lemon and old books, Amanda sat between two sleeping boys and thought about the word mother. Had the word been a badge she earned the night of childbirth, or had it been an accumulation of a million small acts? The question felt less theoretical and more like a living ledger that needed constant review. She realized that in the space of recovery, there was a moral imperative to build a home where both boys could learn to ask for help and to trust it when it came. There was also, quietly, the matter of accountability beyond the courts. Amanda attended meetings with hospital administrators who promised reforms. She invested in oversight for the nursery at St. Nicholas and in training that would make the chain of custody for newborns harder to tamper with. She worked with St. Mary's to make the orphanage less dependent on ad hoc donations and more tied into a network of professionals who could ensure children received regular care. Her philanthropy, once broadcast in gala lights, pivoted to the daily practices that keep institutions honest. As the camera lights dimmed on the public spectacle, the private work continued. Therapy sessions, school registrations, small fights between boys that were met with patient instruction rather than punishment, and quiet dinners where everyone had a seat. The mansion retained its vast rooms, but gradually filled with the clutter of two lives at work: textbooks, a little truck, an audio player for Peter, and a small stack of library books Philip insisted on taking anywhere. Amanda kept singing the lullaby at night, and its three notes, once a solitary comfort, had become a thread that tied past to present and pain to hope. The case would continue to unfold in courtrooms and in the slow motion of community dealing. The long-term futures of Chisholm and Amarka, of Dr. Admi's career, of the hospital's reputation, these remained indefinido. What was certain for now was this: the truth had been found. It had been framed by cold footage and warm admissions, and now the larger work of repair, of care, and of making systems less prone to exploitation had to be lived out in days that did not make good headlines. Amanda did not pretend to have solved all of it. She had, in public eyes and in private practice, reclaimed a son and held the boy she had raised. She had used wealth to create resources, but she also accepted that wealth could not buy back lost years. She could only provide steadiness and therapy and the scaffolding for a scar to mend, and she would. In the nursery, on a morning when sunlight feathered through gauze curtains, Philip and Peter played with the same puzzle board, their small hands fitting pieces into the whole. They argued over a piece, and then negotiated with the instantaneous generosity only children know. One offered the other half, and both laughed. Amanda watched from the doorway, Jacob at her side, and felt an ache that was different from grief. A softer, more resilient thing that might, in time, become gratitude for the possibility of healing. The narrative was not finished. Legal resolutions were pending. Psychological recovery would be long and uneven. Relationships had been severed in ways not easily mended. But the core truth that had begun this turbulent course, what had been stolen and what had been reclaimed, had been made evident. The baby's true identity had been revealed. The poor mechanic had stood against a system and a betrayal. The 65-year-old billionaire had used resources both to prove that truth and to bind the children back, physically and emotionally, into a home where love would now have to withstand the memory of deceit. There would be more to say, more to fight for, and more to repair. For now, the children slept. The cameras kept their slow watch. Amanda inhaled the small, ordinary smell of 2 sleeping boys and felt, with a clarity that pain had lent her, that the work of being a mother sometimes meant holding things together, long after the world had demanded proof. If you were moved by Amanda's fight and want to hear what happens next, to follow the legal outcomes, the boy's recovery, and the rest of the family's reckoning, comment what you would do in her place, and subscribe to catch Part 3.